This is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about Lincoln again in this number four in this talk, in different series and different objectives looking at the life of Abraham Lincoln. I want to sit down and talk about Lincoln's abilities during the war. And this is very important because Abraham Lincoln was quite famous in the 1850s as a railroad attorney. And he was great. He made a lot of money for them. And also, he was receiving payments of like $5,000 to split with his law partner, Herndon. And that's a remarkable amount of money in those days. But Lincoln was an extremely successful lawyer and a railroad attorney. And one of the things that he was very good at was doublespeak. And we'll get into that a little later, but just keep that in the back of your mind. I wanted to talk about Lincoln and the war, Lincoln and his many, many actions. And the fact is that lots of histories only take parts and take pieces. And there again, as I was sitting there, I've been taking Lincoln apart a little bit. It maybe not be the most fair thing to do, but I wanted to talk about many different sides of him because there was this cold side to him. There was this fun, interesting side. This side that was absolute genius. And then there was the lawyer. And the lawyer is really incredible. And I have to tell you, Abraham Lincoln, when he becomes president, when the war starts, it's an incredible thing. And you know something? To get to know Lincoln is very important. You got to read a lot of stuff. I've been kind of studying Lincoln on and off for about 50 years. And a few books here I pulled out here I figured I'd share with you. This is a reprint put out by the Lakeside Classics, which is really phenomenal. They put out one book a year, but this is one. And it's called Behind the Scenes, and it was by Elizabeth Keckley. And Elizabeth Keckley was an African-American ex-slave who worked for Mary Lincoln as a dressmaker, as a seamstress. And she got to watch what was going on behind the scenes and wrote about it. And that's important because all of a sudden you get a different view because you really don't get much of a kind of a fun, a home view of the Lincoln family. I mean, she sits there and talks about Lincoln talking to the goats in the backyard, leaning out the window and having a great conversation with them. And he was having fun. He was enjoying the goats. He liked them. Here's another book that's very interesting that you don't see very often. It's called 6 Months in the White House by Francis Carpenter. Now, who is Francis Carpenter? Well, Francis Carpenter painted that famous portrait of the reading and signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And he asked Lincoln if he could paint the room, if he could paint all the details of the room, paint all the participants, and spend a lot of time with him. And actually, there were photographs taken of Lincoln to aid Carpenter in his work. Some of those photographs still exist. They're very interesting. They're kind of candid photographs with Lincoln kind of just sitting in a chair, trying to look like he was when he was dealing with the proclamation. But the Emancipation Proclamation is very important. We'll talk about that shortly, too. But he spent 6 months in the White House and gave a wonderfully candid impression of Lincoln. You know, Lincoln in the house. He got to sit there and watch him. There's lots of other people that wrote stuff. There were people that didn't write things too favorable about Lincoln. And, I'm upside down. Sorry about that. This is probably a really fascinating thing. I shared this with you. I guess it was maybe maybe 5 years ago. And this is the cover page. Look at it carefully. It's from 1863. And it's very important because this is somebody who was very much against Lincoln and led to some very, very nasty actions. The Honorable C.L. Vallandigham, I can't quite pronounce his name quite right. I'm sure that's not right. And it's the record of this congressman from Ohio on abolition, the Union, and the Civil War. Now, he was totally against Lincoln and totally against Lincoln's actions. And Lincoln had him arrested by a military group, and they took him and brought him to the South. Well, the South didn't want him either, so he ended up going to Canada. He became a man without a country, in a sense, in many respects. He even ran for office for Ohio from Canada, which is kind of interesting. Now, I have 4 editions of this, and it would be just too high to put them all here, but here's one of them. These are the messages, documents of state, from 1864, 1865, and very, very important. I mean, you have to understand all of the stuff that was going on. Now, here's the thing that we never, ever talk about. That during this whole time of the American Civil War, there were a lot of issues taking place. First off, the South, its big product was cotton. And for many years, England was very big into the South and its cotton. And the South kind of thought that with this war, England would come to their aid, and to a degree they did. A lot of the ships that were used by the South, the warships, were made in England. The commerce raider, the Alabama, was built in England and had a number of English in its crew. And when the final battle took place between the Alabama and the Kearsarge, a lot of the people were picked up in England and brought back. I mean, it was really kind of incredible when you think about it. But England had a decided interest in the South. Now, it wasn't totally about cotton, because here's the thing that totally changes the whole equation. Because if this didn't happen, something terrible would have happened here for the North. The South, its biggest product was cotton, and for many, many years, its cotton went to England. And then India became part of the British Empire, became the jewel in the crown. And what did they make in India? Cotton. And so because of that, they got tons of cotton, and they didn't need it from the South. And the cotton would sit on the docks and just rot. And that one wish and dream of the South would never come to fruition. But England was sympathetic to the South and did a lot to help it. In fact, the South was trying so hard to be recognized by England. They tried the Vatican. Actually, Jefferson Davis wrote letters to the Vatican. Abraham Lincoln wrote letters too. So they would both be recognized. And to a degree, the Vatican kind of recognized the South, basically receiving the letter and responding, I believe. Another thing that's kind of interesting as well is that England wouldn't have minded, trying to gain control of the West again. In fact, they had a whole bunch of troops up in Canada, just in case something went awry. Now, here is where it really starts getting crazy, because we were that close to a world war. You had lots of troops in Canada. England was not happy with the North. If it wasn't for our ambassador, who is never talked about, And Charles Francis Adams, who was the son of John Quincy Adams, was our ambassador to the court of St. James. And he was instrumental in keeping everything in check. And that's what you'll find here. So much in these series of books. You'll find tons of stuff from Seward, and of course, you'll see lots of letters from Charles Francis Adams. These are great books because, we talk about the history and you read the history books, but man, when you start looking at the real history and look at all the documents and everything else going on, and it isn't light reading, okay? It takes a lot of time. You have to spend a lot of time reading these books. There's so much information. And after you read them, you got to read them again because you only absorbed about a quarter of it. And that's very important. And so there was an awful lot going on, all circulating around Lincoln and the Civil War. The Civil War did not go well for the North. Not at all. The first 2 years were a disaster. We didn't have good generals. And we didn't have a president that was well-versed in prosecuting a war. But Lincoln took out books, started studying, started researching, and he learned and he grew. He grew magnificently. He grew in his office. And he got rid of the trash and started bringing in better generals. It took a while, but he started bringing in better people. He had McClellan at first, and McClellan was great at drilling people and stuff like that, but he was an arrogant individual who did not think highly of Lincoln. But that's all right. That is all right altogether, because he just went in his own way, and then Lincoln started trying to bring other people in, and they some were decent, some were terrible. You even had, Meade and Gettysburg, which I've talked about before. He said, we've routed the rebels and they're going south. And Lincoln said, get them! Finish them off! What's wrong with you? And he was right. But while all this is going on, he is trying to stave off a world war. Russia was coming to the north. England was involved in the south. You had a lot of stuff going on, a lot of people eyeing our problem. Another thing that was going on at that time was slavery. And slavery was a big issue. Okay? And everybody knew slavery was a big issue. But how do you control it? What do you do? How do you deal with it? And Lincoln's original objective when the Civil War started was to put the Union back together. And Horace Greeley wrote him and said, let's put out a Emancipation Proclamation right away. And Lincoln just basically told him to shut up. He said, if I can save the Union and not free a slave, I'll do it. If I can save the Union and free some slaves, I'll do it. And if I can save the Union and free all the slaves, I'll do it. But basically, shut up and let things alone. And so Greeley got the message. There's more. After about 2 years, and there was a couple of minor victories which weren't that good, Lincoln had to push that wonderful art of doublespeak that he had. And it went into the Emancipation Proclamation. This is the most incredible document ever written by a president, as far as I'm concerned. Because Lincoln had this ability to say an awful lot without saying anything, and to say very little without saying a lot. He was very good at this. And the Emancipation Proclamation did several things. First off, it announced that they were fighting a civil war. And it announced that from this moment on, through basically through his office and through the War Powers Act, that all of the slaves in the South that are in rebellion were free. He said they're all free. However, now there's more to this. If you think about it, where does he have no control whatsoever? In the South, where he has no control. And he only frees those slaves. Now you had the border states, and most of them had slaves. They would remain slaves for the rest of the Civil War. And the slaves in the North, and there were some slaves in the North, would remain slaves until the end of the war. Now, why did he do this? Several very important reasons. First off, he created an atmosphere for the North of jubilation, and for the South of absolute terror. Because if the slaves found out they had been freed, they will revolt. And this is very important because it demoralized the South. It empowered the North. But here is the big thing it did. The Emancipation Proclamation stated in no uncertain terms that what we were fighting was a holy war. We were fighting a holy war to free a people. And how could any European power attack our country when we are in the process of fighting a holy war to free the very people that the English had freed before? It's absolutely brilliant, but did very little. It is from a master politician, a master lawyer, a master of doublespeak. And that was Abraham Lincoln. That is, if you think about it, think about many documents put out by presidents. This is incredible. Because it, once again, it said a lot, and it did everything. But in many cases, it did very little. But it had an effect. Even if you watch the movie Lincoln, you'll see where they use a little bit of Lincoln's wonderful doublespeak. He was meeting with commissioners and members of the Confederacy on a riverboat outside of Washington, D.C. And then they asked him, they said, "Are you meeting with commissioners in Washington, D.C. From the South?" And he said, "No, I'm not meeting with any commissioners in Washington, D.C." No, he was meeting in another state. That's where. And so he would always confound his enemies. He was always 2 steps ahead of them. He was brilliant. Now, wouldn't it be interesting if Lincoln had lived? And there is a side to this, unfortunately. If Lincoln had lived, I don't think he would have the stellar reputation he has today, because heroes know when to die. But just thinking about that whole thing with emancipation, it made into a holy war. Brilliant. All of the other things that he did with this country, if you think about it, he had to suspend habeas corpus. He became a dictator of sorts. He did some nefarious things, which, if you're in a civil war, I guess you have to. And that's covered in other things we talked about. And when we finally got toward the end of the Civil War, and everyone knew it was coming to the end, Lincoln went out of his way to push for the 13th Amendment. Now, here's the thing. He never lived to see it come out, but he was involved in the beginnings of it. The radical Republicans who did not like Lincoln, and Lincoln did not like them. And there's another question, that had he lived, what would have happened to Lincoln with Reconstruction and the radical Republicans? It would have been an ugly scene. Not as bad as Andrew Johnson, of course, but Lincoln would have run into some serious problems too. But he was a lot smarter than most of those people. And I think he would have pulled through, but still tarnished to a degree. And of course, what Lincoln did, Lincoln's actions, Lincoln's ideas, Lincoln's whole change of this country, he reinvented the United States. He changed its very ideas. And the United States that exists today is the country that was basically recreated by Abraham Lincoln. The radical Republicans did the 13th Amendment, then they had the 14th, and then the 15th, which basically totally changed our country in other ways. Basically added onto the Constitution some very, very important things, which you see to this very day. The 13th and 14th Amendment get mentioned quite a few times in things that are taking place. Other things that Lincoln did, he brought this country along and made it survive, because I think a lesser man would have said, let him go. But no, he said, I have an oath. And he said, I have an oath to protect and preserve and defend this country. And I will. And that he did. And that's very, very important. And we have a lot to say about Lincoln and to thank him for a lot of the stuff he did. There are other parts of Lincoln that are problematic, yes. There were some terrible things he did. There were some illegal things that he did. There was a lot of political shenanigans that he did. But that all came after his death. People didn't even know about it for most of his existence. And Abraham Lincoln was working in some of the most bizarre circumstances that you can imagine. Lots of books have come out about Lincoln. There's thousands of them. And in many cases, in a lot of these books, just a part of Lincoln is shown. You even had the Nicolay and Hay series, a massive thing of books. But they had a censor, and that was Robert Lincoln. Robert Lincoln didn't have much of a sense of humor. He was very serious, and he was very set on creating a certain image of his father. He burned up a lot of his father's papers. He burnt up all of the papers, the letters between Lincoln and his wife, Mary. And he told Hay and Nicolay that they had to get approval from him. So a lot of Lincoln was lost. And as we've mentioned before, so much of Lincoln doesn't exist, so we don't know. But all you can do is marvel at the absolute and incredible brilliance that was Abraham Lincoln, and what he did, how he did things, and how he took a regional civil war and turned it into a holy war that would be observed by the entire world, and no one would dare interrupt it. Very, very important. And this is about all I have to say about Lincoln. I think I've said enough. But learn about Lincoln. Read about Lincoln. There's so many basics about Lincoln. But as I've mentioned before, you pour the water through the cloth, and there's some particles left. Go for the particles. There you'll find your story. There you'll find your history. Don't go by the strained history. Look at the unique stuff. Because the unique stuff is what gives personality and depth and a far more interesting story. Thank you.